Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. It is often said that history is written by the victors. In this week's episode of Horns, we hear from Katie Stallard, a global journalist based in Washington, D.C., and a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholarship, about how history is used by totalitarian leaders in order to rewrite, twist, manipulate, and help to shape national myth and vision. In the case of Russia, in order to justify foreign policy adventures. In the case of China, to promote a vision that strength is necessary in order for the Chinese people to survive. And in the case of North Korea, to bolster the cult of personality surrounding the Kim family. This is a fascinating discussion of how events that we believe we all know are known very differently by people who live in other cultures in an information environment that is tightly controlled. This event was held at the University of Texas, Austin. Let's listen in.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is my first time in Austin and, in fact, Texas. I'm already a huge fan. I'm already planning a return trip. I'm very grateful to Dr. Sheena Chestnut-Greitens for hosting me here and for her continuing scholarship on authoritarianism, which is a huge influence on my own work. So I thought I would start by taking you back to the early months of 2014. And when the idea behind this book really started to take shape for me, although I didn't necessarily fully realize it at the time. So I was based in Russia as the Moscow correspondent for Sky News at the time, but I had spent most of this winter traveling backwards and forwards between Russia and Ukraine, covering the Maidan revolution in Kiev, which culminated in this day of really terrible violence in mid-February 2014. Dozens of protesters were killed, but the President Viktor Yanukovych fled the country for Russia shortly afterwards. His security forces disappeared, and the protesters in Kiev celebrated this as a tremendous victory. But it soon became clear to us as reporters that this was not how everyone in the country, or indeed the Kremlin, were viewing the current situation. So we soon got reports that there were what were being described as little green men. We now know to have been Russian soldiers with their insignia removed, taking control of key local government buildings in Crimea, the Black Sea Peninsula in southern Ukraine. They had also taken control of the airport. So the only way to get there from Kiev was by car, which is, I think, about an 18-hour drive. So we set off, we changed cars in Kherson, one of the areas where fighting is currently concentrated in Ukraine, because we didn't want to have Kiev plates, we wanted a local vehicle. But as we approached Crimea, close to the middle of the night, we were stopped at a checkpoint operated by these men with masks and guns. They flagged down our car, wrenched open the front passenger side door, and went to grab my colleague Vadim's camera, who promptly swore at them in his swarthiest Soviet Army Russian, and everyone relaxed. I was based in Russia at the time. The rest of the team was Russian, and we had Russian Foreign Ministry accreditation. And that was enough for them to crucially let us go through the checkpoint, agree not to steal our equipment, but also to talk to us a little bit about, from their perspective, what they believed was happening right now. So some of these men had come across the border from southern Russia. Others said that they were local. Some said that they had come up from Crimea. But as far as they were concerned, understanding the events in Kiev primarily through the prism of Russian language television and Russian state propaganda, they were being told that this was actually a fascist coup, that these neo-Nazis and fascist forces had overthrown their legitimately elected president, taken control of the capital, and that they were even now moving south through the country and threatening Russian speakers in the south and the east of Ukraine. So one man described this to me that night as, these are barbarians and fascists trying to turn our Slavic world into hell. And I was really struck by how quickly they would reference the Second World War, or as it's known in Russia, the Great Patriotic War, to describe the current situation. So another man who had come across the border from southern Russia told me, this is the land of our ancestors who spilled their blood in the Great Patriotic War. Now the fascists are on the rise again, and we are here to show that it's not going to work. A number of them, you may not be able to quite make it out on the slides here, but a number of them are wearing these orange and black ribbons on their shoulders, which are known as the St. George's ribbon. It's an orange and black ribbon that's based on the Victory Medal from the Second World War. And really from the outset, of the crisis, those on the pro-Russian side were wearing this ribbon as a symbol of which side they were on and of their core beliefs. And in Crimea itself, this was how the Russian takeover was being framed. So Russian language television, which was genuinely popular there, and all of the accompanying propaganda, framed this as a choice between the fascists and the militants who had taken control of Kiev and the safety of Russia. So you would see billboards by the side of the road that show, the Crimean Peninsula dominated by this huge black swastika, and a choice between that and the Russian flag. And as the conflict got underway in eastern Ukraine, so this is a picture taken in Donetsk, where the pro-Russian separatists had declared their own separatist enclave, the Donetsk People's Republic, one of two next door to Luhansk People's Republic. If you watched Russian language television there, which a number of people did, you were told that they were being shelled not by Ukrainian government forces, but by this fascist-controlled militant force. And I remember one particular conversation with this family that was taking shelter in a basement in Donetsk through some of the height of the shelling in January 2015, and asking one of the children what they understood was happening and who was shooting at them. And this little boy said, it's fascists. Fascists are shooting at us. It's important to say this is not how everybody in eastern Ukraine, by a long way, viewed the situation. And when given the choice, many people opted to leave the Donbass region for the government-controlled territory. But for people who were more invested, particularly in Russian language television, this is the view of the conflict that was being sold to them. And back in Russia itself, it was pretty well wall-to-wall propaganda about the horrors and the atrocities of Ukraine. And it felt really like moving between parallel realities, moving from what we had seen as a team on the ground in the Ukrainian government-controlled parts of Ukraine, which were broadly functioning and certainly were not beset by genocidal militants or fascists, and then the rebel-controlled regions, and back in Russia itself, under the control of Russian language propaganda, you would believe that there was just this totally separate reality taking place, where fascists were roaming the streets, where Russian speakers, women and children, were under terrible threat, and these genocidal atrocities were taking place. And when we would go back to Russia from our reporting trips to Ukraine, my Russian colleagues would sometimes find that their own family members didn't believe them about what they had just seen. They would say, Dad, I've just come from this territory. This is what I've seen with my own eyes. And they would find that it was very difficult to compete with the narrative on the television. I think the worst of this was a story that ran on Channel 1, which is one of Russia's most popular television channels, in July 2014, when they had a story that Ukrainian government forces were said to have crucified a 3-year-old boy. So this was a story that ran with a supposed eyewitness, a woman who was sobbing and really struggling for her words as she was describing what had happened. And she claimed that the Ukrainian government forces had taken this 3-year-old boy, because his father was fighting with the separatists, bound him to a post in the center of a square in the town of Slavyansk, and tortured him to death. She claimed she'd been there, that other people had fainted at the sound of his screams, and then his mother was tied to a tank and dragged to her death around the rest of the town. This didn't happen, and reporters from other channels were subsequently able to speak to people in Slavyansk, none of whom had witnessed this because it was complete fiction. But viewers of Channel 1 were never told that it wasn't true. So this is the kind of thing that people have been told. For 8 years now, Ukrainian government forces are trading in Ukraine. And this was all set against a backdrop of Vladimir Putin's presidency and his efforts to really stoke commemoration of the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War. So he brought these really bombastic, militaristic celebrations of the end of the war in Europe. And he had obviously appointed himself front and center as the man to uphold the legacy of the war. Very early on, he established something called the Pobieda, or the Victory Committee, which included some of the most senior officials in Russia, including the heads of the various intelligence services, and was designed to coordinate commemoration of the conflict, to ensure that younger generations were understanding all of the facts and the official narrative that the government wanted them to understand about this war. He personally chaired it to show the importance that he placed on it. And it became a real, it's not an exaggeration to say it was a priority to both protect and to elevate the memory of the war, which people have talked about now as really something approaching to a national religion in Russia under Putin's rule. It hasn't always been like this. It's easy to look at the parades taking place in Red Square now and to assume this has been an annual tradition since the end of the war. Russia and Soviet forces suffered dreadfully, and it is often missing from our stories in the West about the war, the extent of the suffering and the losses that took place in the Soviet Union. Stalin presided over the first Victors' Parade, which was in June 1945, and May 9th, the end of the war in Europe on Moscow time, was declared a national holiday to be known as Victory Day. But 2 years later, in 1947, Stalin cancelled the holiday. He demoted some of his key commanders, and the overwhelming message about the war was that, yes, it had proved the strength of the Soviet system. It was a testament to Stalin's visionary leadership, but it was time to move on, to get back to the work of building socialism. There were no great rewards coming. And Stalin was also very concerned that some of these great war heroes who had genuinely fought and led, these historic campaigns might themselves become popular figures in their own right and might prove a threat to him. So he wanted to move on from it. And it wasn't until 2 decades later, in 1965, that Leonid Brezhnev brought back Victory Day, reintroduced the Victory Parade, and started to build the foundations of what's been described as the cult of the Great Patriotic War that we know today. But again, that tailed off under the rule of Mikhail Gorbachev. Once the archives were opened, people could conduct a more critical examination of the war, and some of the horrors and the atrocities became clearer. Gorbachev took an approach to the war that described it as both a heroic great victory and a tragedy. So it really detracted from this kind of triumphal, bombastic approach to the celebrations. And it wasn't until Vladimir Putin came to power at the turn of the millennium that he really shifted gears on that and really returned the war to the central position that we know today. And he described it as an event that should link the past, present, and future. His predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, had tried and failed to come up with a new national idea for Russia post the fall of the Soviet Union. They had actually held a nationwide competition for ideas, formed a committee, but they had come up empty-handed. They were forced to abandon the project. Putin, from very early on, seized on the memory of the Great Patriotic War as a testament to Russia's great power status and the idea that Russia was victorious and would always be a victorious country. So he really set about selling a very different vision of Russia to Russian people. And that kind of shift in pace was genuinely welcome for a lot of people after the turbulence, the economic chaos of the 1990s, to have this vision of Russia as a great country that would reclaim its rightful place in the world, that would be great and respected once again. That was genuinely attractive to a number of his citizens. It's important to say that this was not just a top-down initiative. Commemoration of the war is not something that has been imposed on Russia from its government against an unwilling public. Commemoration of the war, even after Stalin had cancelled the former celebrations, still took place at a grassroots level. Veterans would still come together, wear their uniforms, exchange memories about the war. And it was a conflict that touched so many families across the nation. Every Russian family has some connection to the Great Patriotic War. And there were grassroots movements that grew up, like the Immortal Regiment, as it was known, which was started by 3 friends in Tomsk in Siberia in 2012. Now, they felt that the official approach to the war had gone too far. It was over the top, bombastic, official, militaristic, and it had lost the memory of the real people that had fought and the real lives that were lost. So they came up with the idea that on Victory Day, they would just march quietly, holding photographs of relatives who had fought during the war. And it would be somber, and it would be reflective, and it would be a chance to put the real people back into the commemoration of the war. It was enormously successful. Within a couple of years, there were hundreds of thousands and then millions of people taking part in these marches across Russia. And so, of course, the government viewed it as something that could not be allowed to continue as a grassroots, bottom-up initiative, but must be brought under some form of supervision. So they came up with their own alternative movement, the Immortal Regiment of Russia, which subsumed the initial movement, and which is now a central part of the commemorative celebrations every May 9th. There are immortal regiments in the United States. I think there was one in New York earlier this year. These events take place around the world. And Putin, by 2015, was marching at the front of the parade. So this is where the title of my book comes from, this quote from one of the founders of that immortal regiment, who really felt that this had just turned into everything it was not meant to be. And he had this quote, which was, guys, stop, just stop. Sometimes this turns into dancing on bones. He wanted the authorities to return the commemoration to what it was meant to be, which was about remembering the real lives, the heroism, the sacrifice of the war. Obviously, that had no effect, and the Immortal Regiment continued as a massive annual event. There were also attempts to seal off the official narrative from challenge. So it is not just that the Russian government has decided we should pay more attention to the history of the war and we should ensure that it is remembered. The idea is that it should be remembered in a certain way. It should be remembered as a heroic, glorious, unifying memory that with values like sacrifice, patriotism, service. It should not be remembered for some of the darker aspects of the war, like the occupation and the mass rapes of Eastern Europe, the purges of the ranks of the officer on the eve of the war, or the mass deportations that took place at the end of the war. That's not the side of the war that the government wants to focus on. So they have passed new laws. There was a new law passed in 2014 which effectively bans the falsification of history under the auspices of banning the rehabilitation of Nazism, which sounds very benign. Who isn't against banning the rehabilitation of Nazism, but meant that you couldn't present a version of the war that disagreed with the findings of the Nuremberg tribunals, and meant that anybody who tried to focus on, for instance, atrocities in Eastern Europe found themselves liable to prosecution under this law. And there have already been prosecutions. The first prosecution was a man from Siberia who was convicted in June 2016. There have also been efforts to dismantle literally the memorial organization, but other organizations that are dedicated to preserving an independent or a more rigorously scrutinized memory of the war. So the memorial organization, which started during Mikhail Gorbachev's rule, and which involved, there were branches all over the country with a lot of the time just volunteers, local historians, who tried to gather the memory of particularly people who had died in Stalin's purges, and to preserve those memories for future generations. But that has become incompatible with Putin's vision for Russia. So one of the people who's been particularly targeted in this crackdown is Yuri Dmitriev, who is responsible for uncovering the site of mass graves in northwestern Russia, where a number of Stalin's victims are buried. But he has come under a lot of scrutiny. A local pro-Kremlin organization has tried to argue with his findings and to suggest that instead of these bodies being the victims of Stalin's purges, what if they were actually the victims of attacks during the Second World War? It's a much better narrative for the government if these are the victims of a foreign aggressor rather than the result of Stalin's own atrocities. So the authorities have really made a concerted effort to discredit Yuri Dmitriev, to undermine his findings, and to challenge his version of the history of the atrocities that took place in that region. He has subsequently been arrested, has gone through numerous trials, and in 2021, at the age of, I think, 65, was sentenced to 15 years in a high-security prison. That same year, December 2021, the Memorial Organization, this Gorbachev-era organization, was formally disbanded. It has been liquidated. It is now operating abroad outside of Russia. And of course, then, several months after that, Putin invaded Ukraine. And the way he sold that conflict to Russian citizens was that once again, as with the Great Patriotic War, these terrible forces of fascism and these threats to Russian speakers were on the rise in Europe once again. And once again, it had fallen to Russia to defend these innocent victims and to prosecute what he described as a special military operation for the demilitarization and the denazification of Ukraine. So he has really drawn on this narrative of the war and of Russia's past heroism to frame the current conflict there. But this is not only happening in Russia. So after several years in Russia, I moved to Beijing, where I was based until early 2018. And one of my first major assignments there was covering the Victory Day parade, which is very familiar to me coming from Russia, through Tiananmen Square in September 2015. So this was to celebrate the anniversary of the end of the war in Asia. It was a tremendously vast event. You know, you could feel the ground trembling beneath you as the ballistic missile launchers and the tanks rolled through Tiananmen Square. It was an extraordinary display of patriotism, and Vladimir Putin was there alongside Xi Jinping. And again, it looked like, observing this for the first time, this must be an annual tradition. This must be a way that the war has been remembered here since the end of the war. But that was not the case. This was the first time this event had ever been held. And it was not one of several new memorial days that were announced the previous year in 2014, including a memorial day for martyrs and heroes who had given their lives for China, and to remember the Nanjing massacre, which took place during the war. So these were really important national level events, which were attended by the standing committee, the most important men in China, and were again elevated into this really prominent role. Xi Jinping had talked since really the first weeks of his leadership about the importance of instilling greater control of ideology in China and guarding against what he called historical nihilism, which has effectively come to mean challenging the official version of history. And the war has become quite central to the story that he tells about China and its history, and crucially why, in his version of events, the Communist Party needs to be in power. So when he first took office, China's version of the Second World War, the War of Resistance, was officially deemed to begin with the attack on the Marco Polo Bridge on the outskirts of Beijing in 1937. But as of 2017, that is no longer the case. It is now deemed to start 6 years earlier in Shenyang in September 1931, and what had previously been described as the 8-year War of Resistance is now formally known as the 14-year War of Resistance. There is absolutely a credible historical case to make that change. There was a 6-year regional conflict that took place in the northeast of China beginning in 1931. But where previously that had generally been taught as two separate but related conflicts, now they were rolled into one grand narrative, which also included, crucially, a period when the communist forces were much more active. They were very much part of the regional war in the northeast of the country, whereas by the time it had become the nationwide war and moving south through Beijing, the communist forces were much less involved, and it was the Kuomintang, the KMT, that was doing much of the fighting and dying. So this has also included, as it has in Russia, an attempt to preserve national myths and stories from the war, including the story of the heroes of Langya Shan, so the heroes of Wolf's Tooth Mountain. This is a story that every Chinese school child knows. It describes the heroism of 5 individual communist soldiers who are said to have sacrificed their own lives by staging a diversionary action to draw Japanese forces up a mountain and save the main column of Chinese forces, and then to have thrown themselves to their deaths, shouting something to the effect of "Long live the Communist Party," so that they would not be captured and their weapons could not be used against their comrades. There has since been a fair amount of evidence come to light that that story is not true, not least because at least 2 of the men seem to have survived. But when an independent historian based in Beijing, a man called Hong Zhenghuai, tried to carry out his own research into this story in 2012, and he published an article about it in 2013, he ran up against pretty serious consequences. So all he had tried to say was, we should re-examine this story. We should not just deal in myth and fable. We should look, now that we have the ability, at what the facts say, what evidence there is for this story, and what actually happened on Langya Mountain, if indeed anything happened at all. But under Xi Jinping's rule, and this was something that, talking to historians in China, had been more possible in previous eras. There were areas of great sensitivity, and you often had to be very careful with how you approach sensitive subjects and how far you could go. But a degree of independent scrutiny and challenging of official narratives was possible. And the magazine that he was writing for, Yanhuang Chunche, had published, it's too much to say wholly critical articles, but at least somewhat skeptical articles in previous years. But he soon found out that that was no longer possible. He was sued, firstly by pro-Beijing commentators, but then ended up in the national court system, was ordered to apologize, lost his job, and when I spoke to him in 2017, found he was on a travel blacklist, so he could no longer, he was not able to leave China. It was impossible for him to publish any material in mainland Chinese platforms. He could only really write for foreign publications now, and the magazine that he wrote for, Yanhuang Chunche, was taken over. It was put under much more pro-Beijing, party-controlled management. So the degree of scrutiny and of challenge to these official narratives really felt like it was being closed down in real time. These changes to the official story had a real impact on individual lives too. So one of the clear shifts in the Chinese story, which, as in Russia, for the first couple of decades after the war, and really until Mao Zedong's death in 1976, was secondary to the narrative of Mao's Great Revolution, the narrative of class struggle. The war against Japan, which had involved so much of an element of the Kuomintang's fighting, and particularly while Chiang Kai-shek was still alive and on Taiwan and potentially a threat to the Communist Party on the mainland, which is not something Mao was particularly interested in focusing on. It was after his death in the 80s and under Deng Xiaoping that there was an effort to rewrite the history of the war. And in 1985, it was officially described as an all-nation war of resistance. The Kuomintang's contribution to the fighting was brought back into the central narrative. And it meant that, firstly, many more of the battles and the terrible atrocities that had taken place could be part of the war story. But it also meant that real individuals could now talk openly about their family members and their service during the war. So I met this lady, Zhao Yan, who runs a magazine store in central Shanghai, who had this extraordinary story to tell about her grandfather, Peng Shiliang, who was a senior commander with the KMT, who died in 1941 in what seemed to be extraordinarily heroic circumstances, covering fire while the rest of his unit made their escape and was killed in the process. But for her childhood and her early life, she was not allowed to talk about him because he had served under the KMT. He was designated as a counter-revolutionary. And during the Cultural Revolution in China from 1966 to 1976, the family really suffered because of their associations with the KMT. They were set down. Her mother was fired from her job, and they were really under great pressure to not talk about their ancestor, Peng Shiliang, and to downplay any connections between themselves, the war, and this history. But once the national story of the war started to change in 1985, Peng Shiliang was ping-fanged or rehabilitated. So basically the black mark against his name was removed. It was now possible for the family to talk about who he was. But since Xi Jinping has come to power, that has gone much further. He's now been promoted to a Class A martyr. There's a statue dedicated to his sacrifice. So the experience of the rewriting of the war history, while Zhao Yan feels very, very positively about what's happened now, is that on a personal level, she's able just to talk to people about who her grandfather was, what he did during the war. But as the national story has been rewritten, there are other stories of how people have been redesignated from villains to heroes, or likewise. Finally, in China, and I actually think I probably wouldn't be allowed to do this today, but in 2018, I was able to go into a high school in Anhui province, Pengbu High School, number 2, and sit in on a history class to understand how the war was being taught, what some of these students were learning, and how they were coming to think about the Second World War and its history. So the version of the war that they were taught by then was the 14-year war, going from 1931 to 1945. And from the class that I sat in on and the textbooks that I was able to access, it focused very heavily on the atrocities and the horrors that China had suffered during the war. So there was this very graphic imagery, and I was quite shocked by some of the material that was in the textbooks showing decapitated heads. It was very gruesome, very bloody. And when I spoke to some of the students after the class, these were 15 and 16-year-olds, and asked them what really struck them about the history of the war and what was important for them to understand, they all referred to how China had suffered in the past because of its weakness. Central to this story was the idea that China, which was then under the control of the Republic of China and the KMT government, had become weak, had become unable to defend itself, and it was only with the Communist Party coming to power that was turned around. China became strong and it could defend itself. So the kind of things people were telling me, like Yao Mingming, who was 16, talked about how it hurt her feelings to see her ancestors lying on the ground. 17-year-old Ma Chanhui talked about how China was not strong enough in the past. Just because China was weak, it went through hundreds of years of history of humiliation and hardship. And I guess that this is why it's necessary to be strong. It's the only way to protect itself from being invaded again. Another young woman, Yang Yujie, who was 16, described crying when she first learned about the history of the war, because she had always thought of China as a very strong country, but she didn't know the recent history. So she was very sad and upset. And from then, I know our Chinese must be strong again. I think the important thing to draw out of all of these responses is the link, which was made directly in the history lesson that I sat in on, between that past suffering and the current regime, and why it was important now for China both to be under the Communist Party's leadership and to build up its national strength. I will keep this fairly brief because I think we're running a little, I'm probably running a little bit over my time allowance. But from Beijing, I was also covering North Korea. I reported from the border region in Dandong, spoke to defectors and reported from the border regions in South Korea, and on 2 occasions traveled to North Korea itself. And I was really struck, having seen how central the war story and these national historical narratives were in Russia and China, that in North Korea, it just felt like this was the case, but to the absolutely nth degree. That the history of the war, and in this case primarily the Korean War, was really a central part of the regime's narrative and to a certain extent of daily life. It was certainly how the regime explained all of the hardship, all of the difficulties as a continuation of this long struggle that North Korea was fighting and had long fought against foreign imperialists. So there are essentially 2 foundational myths that the Kim regime, which is now in its 3rd generation under Kim Jong Il, relies on. The first relates to the Second World War as we would know it, and is the myth that Kim Il-sung, the founding leader, the current leader's grandfather, liberated the Korean peninsula from Japanese colonial rule. So Korea had been annexed by Japan in 1910. Kim Il-sung had genuinely, his family had suffered under colonial rule, and he had been forced to go across the border into Manchuria, northeast China, in his early life. And he had genuinely fought in the anti-Japanese guerrilla struggle. But he had fought primarily in Manchuria, northeastern China. And his struggle was over by 1941. Japanese control of northeast China was really consolidated by then, and he and his remaining partisans were forced to flee across the border into the Soviet Union, where they more or less waited out the last 4 years of that war, from 1941 until 1945, at a Red Army base near Khabarovsk. In real life, he returned to North Korea, as it was then a divided peninsula, after the end of the war, in fact, at least a month after the end of the war, in 1945, and took no part in the final, as it would go on to be known, the liberation struggle against Japan. But over the decades, that story has really changed. So in the early years, if you had heard this story in the early 1950s, the version of the story that you would have heard was that the Korean partisans were supporting the Soviet army, that it was the Soviet army that was in the lead as they forced Japan off the Korean peninsula and secured this great victory. But as Kim Il-sung's personality cult developed and his dependence on his Soviet patrons diminished, his own role in the story grew and grew. So you would then hear that it was the Korean partisans and this organization that there's no evidence ever existed, the Korean People's Revolutionary Army, that led the offensive to liberate the Korean peninsula with the Soviet army in support. And now, as the story has currently become, it is more or less solely the Koreans who defeat Japan and liberate the Korean peninsula. So the Kim family really trades on this idea that Kim Il-sung is the founding leader who secured Korea's liberation. The second important myth is that he then defended the country once again from an attack which is taught in North Korea as a US and South Korean instigated invasion at the start of the Korean War. Of course, in real life, that is the opposite of what happened. It is North Korea that invaded South Korea. But as that story is told there, it is North Korea that was the innocent victim of this surprise attack masterminded by the US imperialists. But building on the slightly fantastical story of his earlier guerrilla heroism, Kim is said to have used all of that great knowledge and his tactics to mastermind this, what is portrayed in North Korea as a great victory against the US. As we know, it culminated in a ceasefire in 1953, and it has in fact never come to a formal end. But as the story is told in North Korea, it ended in a great victory for North Korea as the US imperialists were humbled, forced to drop to their knees. That version of the story is generally accompanied by photographs of negotiators during the armistice negotiations looking tired to show how the US forces had been humbled and exhausted. So as this story goes in North Korea, Kim Il-sung not only liberated his country, but then defended it from this foreign invasion in the space of less than a decade. He defeated these two great imperialisms, Japan and then the United States. And that's the story that his grandson still trades on to this day. It's not just the overall narrative and the arc and the heroism of this story that matters in North Korea. It's also the terrible atrocities that they blame on the United States. So they focus, and I apologize for the slightly graphic nature of one of these images, but North Korean children are taught from a very early age about the barbaric attacks that US soldiers are said to have perpetrated against their citizens. And they are encouraged to, even to this day, to vow their generally thrice-fold revenge. And this was something that Kim Jong Il prioritized quite early after coming to power. So he assumes power after the death of his father, late 2011 into 2012. And within 2 years has ordered the rebuilding and the significant expansion of two of the country's war museums. The first is the Victoria's Fatherland Liberation War Museum, which preserves the memory of the Korean War. And the second is the probably self-explanatory named Sinchon Museum of American War Atrocities, which preserves the largely fictional memory of the horrors of the war. So it is impossible to get real facts, figures as to how much this costs, but I've toured the first museum in Pyongyang, and it is an extraordinary building. I think the entranceway is 5-6 stories high, lined with chandeliers, gilded, ornate decorations everywhere. This is money that North Korea doesn't have. Given how many of the North Korean population it goes hungry, is unable to provide for safe nutrition for their children on a daily basis, it is striking that Kim Jong Un has dedicated what appear to be significant resources to rebuilding museums and preserving the history of the war. But that's because this is such an important part of his own claim to legitimacy and the story he tells his own people about why he must be in power. He presents himself as, like his father and his grandfather before him, defending the country against these foreign threats. And it's a key part of the story he tells about why the country now needs to dedicate its, again, very scarce resources into the missile program and the nuclear weapons program. So when you go into North Korean schools or kindergartens, you'll find war imagery very central. So one of these images is at a kindergarten in Pyongyang, where you can see small toddlers touring a model of the replica long-range rocket in their miniature Korean People's Army fighter jets. The picture on the bottom right is in the entranceway to an elementary school. There is a cast model of the Korean peninsula, and then 2 light-up animated models showing the intercontinental ballistic missile launches of 2017. So the war and the modern defenses are really front and centered in the education system and explained to people as a non-negotiable national priority. And this kind of graphic imagery and the idea that North Korea is under threat from these terrible foreign imperialists is also there. So these are images from the corridor of an elementary school, which show a massacre taking place, young children being buried alive, and some of the terrible things that US forces are said to have perpetrated, for which there is no evidence, set against an image of the Kim family leaders who are protecting and gathering the Korean people to their bosom and keeping them safe and providing for their happy and peaceful lives. So this is very much how Kim Jong Un, even to the current day, explains the privations that the country experiences. As the story is told there, it's not because of the sanctions that have been imposed because of his nuclear weapons program. It's because this worldwide anti-socialist alliance has focused its forces on North Korea, which has now been forced single-handedly to defend itself against the Allied imperialist forces. And this, when you see the images of Kim Jong-un riding his horse up Mount Paektu, and some of the images that often attract a lot of memes and wry commentary on social media here, this is the story that they are referencing. When he was on his horse riding up Mount Paektu, was said to be inspecting the battlefields where his grandfather had fought and reflecting on his great revolutionary struggle to free Korea from Japanese rule, and then his ongoing struggles against imperialist forces. So he is really trying to keep alive the memory of these past, largely fictional struggles as he makes his own case to North Korean people as to why he needs to be in power and why they need to build up their weapons programs. One question I really struggled with through the reporting of a lot of these stories and of the writing of the book was how to think about how much of this people really believe. It's one thing to make kids learn this, to put it in your textbooks, to have people replicate these answers if they want to do well in their tests. It's one thing to have crowds cheer Kim Jong-un everywhere he goes, and grown adults prostrate themselves and weep hysterically at his glorious leadership. But it's very difficult to understand what people feel privately and what their private connection to these wars is. And one of the ways I came to think about it was that for a proportion of the population, these myths and narratives are effective, as they are here. A proportion of society feels very strongly about a certain version of history, and that's a fundamental part of their identity. And going through some of these great rallies and national performances is a way to enforce and to reinvigorate and to cement, what we might describe as the true believers in their faith in these narratives. But for everyone else, the way I came to think about it was it is effectively a mechanism of control, that regardless of how you actually feel about the Kim family and the history of these wars, you are required to repeat the official lines. You are required to act as if you believe in this version of history. And it's a way to make sure that it's very difficult for individuals to know what anyone else really thinks. If the impression you see is everyone else repeating the lines, screaming for the leader, it's hard to know whether other people share your belief. And it is then, a very dangerous gamble to be the one to raise your hand and speak out and say, I don't see it this way. I don't support. So I came to see these narratives as effectively a mechanism of control, but a powerful tool that each of these regimes has invested considerable resources in. And a part of the story that I felt, particularly as a journalist, covering these countries regularly in terms of their national security implications, the threat that they pose to US security, European security, the international order, that were perhaps sometimes missing the stories these countries were telling themselves and the lengths those in power were going to protect these narratives. Violence, repression, control are absolutely a central part of how they hold on to power. But as we see in all three cases, and particularly now with the current conflict in Ukraine, they're also a powerful resource in their own right. So I think to sort of sum up the common themes of each of these three countries is that I think we need to do a better job of understanding these national narratives to avoid providing our own grist for the historical mill, and to develop, I guess, a more nuanced understanding of some of the mechanisms of regime security and the approach of these various regimes to internal control themselves. But also writing this book primarily in the US and during the Trump presidency, where the debate over historical monuments was very live here, where Trump was trying to set up his own 1776 Patriotic Education Commission, I came to really question how much of a bright dividing line there is between the approach to history in democracies and autocracies. And where I came down on that was, without wanting to make in any way a false equivalency to these very different systems, which are in turn very different from each other, is that the instinct to do this, to manipulate history, to draw on a highly selective version of history, transcends political systems. Democratic politicians, I grew up in the UK, Second World War imagery was a very central part of the Brexit referendum, for instance. This is an impulse that appeals to many political leaders. But the crucial difference in our own societies should be that it is possible to challenge that narrative, and that it is possible to remember the complexities, the darker aspects of history. I think what is different and what is so troubling and what is so clearly to be avoided in these cases is when you get to a scenario where there is only the mythical, simplified, selective version of history that is acceptable, and remembering or scrutinizing or challenging history or remembering any more difficult, more complex aspects of that history is presented as an unpatriotic thing to do. So I came to believe we should be very wary of political leaders who come bearing glorious myths about history, and we should do everything we can ourselves to challenge those narratives and to make sure that we're complicating and asking challenging questions about our own history and the history of our own wars.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.